All right. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. My name is Dr. Ernesto Morales, and I'm a professor of ethnic studies at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm also the national secretary for the Partido Nacional de la Raza Unida, and I have held this position for the last 4 years. I'm excited to be here tonight collaborating with the Chicano Liberation Committee. I admire the exceptional work these young comrades are doing, which I think surpasses much of what we see happening in other parts of the country. The title of this presentation is Exploring Aztlan, From Myth to Insurgency. This presentation is the culmination of many years of research on Aztlan on my part, beginning with my dissertation work at Michigan State University, which eventually led to my book, Insurgent Aztlan, The Healing Power of Cultural Resistance. In this work, I explored national liberation movements and the role of culture within them. I urge you all to keep in mind that this presentation may not be what you expect, but I believe it's crucial to the understanding of the core of this discussion. So, just a few things. I'd like to kind of set some ground rules for this discussion. These rules are ones that we implement in our debates within the Partido Nacional. They help focus, I believe, our conversations on issues rather than personalities. And so first, let's not argue about names. We all know that some people think Aztlan is a silly name or believe it shouldn't be used. And you know what? That's fine. I'm not here to argue for the use of the word Aztlan, despite what the title of this presentation might suggest. By the end, I hope you'll be willing to consider, regardless of what name you use or think should be used, that this discussion is less about the name and more about the political position we consider important. Whether you call it Abya-Yala, Occupied Territories, Turtle Island, or Aztlan, any of these terms work because ultimately it isn't the term that defines the political positions we're discussing. Secondly, let's not argue about oppression. Indigenous people and their descendants have been colonized for 500 years. Debating among ourselves who is more oppressed does not advance our political goals. It simply sets up more divisions that only serve the interest of perpetuating colonial structures. And lastly, within the party, we've emphasized the importance of accepting difference as a sign of political maturity. We understand that true unity, as it is often discussed and called for, is unattainable. And in Raza Unida's opinion, another mechanism of colonial obfuscation. The differences of opinion will always exist. It is a fundamental condition of human nature. Political maturity within a national framework involves accepting different viewpoints and methods of resisting oppression when they differ from our own. Accomplishing that type of unity in the name of nation is the best growth the Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx communities can hope for right now. For this presentation, we have 3 main objectives. First, to provide an understanding of Aztlan's historical and cultural significance. Second, to explore the development and impact of Aztlan as an anti-colonial ideology. And third, to foster an engaging discussion about Aztlan's role in Chicano national liberation. The presentation is structured around these objectives, which align with 3 key questions we will consider on the next slide. It is crucial to have clear objectives when teaching within the Chicano community. Far too often, people start talking without a clear purpose, which often leads to emotional conversations that are satisfying because of their emotionality, but ideologically unfocused. This approach doesn't help us achieve clarity or coherence. Without intentionality in our discussions, we risk repeating ourselves or merely echoing others without digging deeper into the issues. Professor Reynaldo Macias, who is a professor at the University of California in Los Angeles, recently published a book chapter on sociolinguistics, specifically addressing Chicano studies and what he calls La Perspectiva Chicana. In the article, in the book chapter, Macias provides an epistemological framework for approaching Chicano studies, and I believe, by proxy, Chicano national liberation. Macias suggests 3 fundamental questions that all Chicano study scholars, and I would add activists and organizers, should consider. Those questions are, who are we? What is our material condition? and what can be done about it. These questions are grounded in a materialist and Marxist framework. The first question, who are we, highlights our ongoing struggle with identity, a direct result of our colonization. Debating labels like Chicano, Latino, or Hispanic only reinforces the colonial narrative of our own inability to agree. Right out of the gate, disunity is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Recognizing that we are a conquered, colonized people who have endured 500 years of oppression leads us to question our existence and what it is that we are trying to accomplish. While we've addressed the second question, what is our material condition, more thoroughly in recent times, anti-colonial and decolonial conversations especially, these answers still mostly center on exploring or detailing our social, political, and economic subjugation. This and the question of who we are is dealt with almost exclusively within the context of our colonized status and the havoc it has wreaked on us for the past 500 years. In other words, these conversations tend to focus on the problems caused by colonization rather than exploring solutions or envisioning a future beyond colonial oppression. The Partido believes this hinders progress towards liberation. The third question, what can be done about it, remains the most challenging. To answer this, we must fully understand our identity and material conditions as prerequisites of national liberation. If we acknowledge these as the building blocks of what the Partido refers to as ser humano, a fully realized individual who is conscious of their history, culture, and political position within a society marked by colonialism and oppression. From there, we can more effectively address our liberation without being misled by colonial political processes that do not offer true sovereignty to indigenous people. In addition to the three central questions, Macias suggests incorporating four dimensions: historicizing, contextualizing, politicizing, and indigenizing. When answering the questions of who we are, what are our material conditions, and what can be done about it, we must consider the historical context, but also move beyond history to analyze the contemporary moment. Contextualizing our history doesn't mean framing it strictly in opposition to a settler colonial framework, as that would only reinforce colonial structures. Instead, we must understand the political implications of being Chicano outside this framework, the colonial framework. How do we develop, maintain, and grow a Chicano politic? Finally, indigenizing involves reclaiming our indigenous identities, but not just as individuals, but as nation. This framework of the three questions and the four dimensions pushes us to rethink our positions, acknowledge the contradictions of our colonialism, and seek resolutions that cannot come from settler colonial frameworks. It also begs the question, what is Chicano politics without settler colonialism? I want you to think about that. Let's start by reading the quote at the bottom of this. We're gonna read it in parts. This quote is from Amilcar Cabral's address to the Tricontinental Congress in 1966 in Havana, Cuba. In part, it states, national liberation is the phenomenon in which a given socioeconomic whole rejects the negation of its historical process. So in other words, national liberation involves regaining a people's historical identity by ending imperialist domination. Cabral is very clear that that doesn't mean, in what he's saying, returning to how we lived 500 years ago, because clearly the material conditions have changed. What it's talking about, or what he's talking about, is ending settler colonialism, and by ending settler colonialism, regaining this national identity, or what he calls the historical personality of the people. It's return to history through the destruction of the imperialist domination to which it was subjected. So if you look at the slide, what he means by a return to history is laid out here. So who are we, right? This in part is covered in our indigenous history. We talk about our indigenous history. And so at this moment, right, there's a moment that comes, this moment of contact that later turns into this moment of conquest. And we find ourselves as indigenous people living in the settlers' history. We're not living through our history right now. We are living through their history. And we are in opposition to what is happening, right? Because what they've done by stopping that, is they have taken away our national identity, right? Which is, if you really stop and think about the question that I asked a second ago, what is a Chicano politic without settler colonialism? Well, in the beginning, what it is a national liberation movement. Because what Cabral is saying is that the only way for a group of people to return to history is through the destruction of the system that keeps them, that's holding them hostage, right? So as Chicanos, we are in the process, as indigenous people, we are in the process of rejecting the history imposed on us by settler colonialism. And we see it all around us, right? We see this happening every day. Every time somebody says that's not the whole story, we know that they are in the process of rejecting the history imposed on them by settler colonialism. But what are we moving towards, right? Are we moving towards self-determination and the destruction of imperialist domination? I mean, these are the questions that we have to start asking ourselves now. So when we say it's not what you think, we mean that Aztlan is more than a cultural symbol. It is a political formation with a long history of empowering and reclaiming indigenous Mexican-American identity. Aztlan is also the only significant demand of the Chicano power movement that isn't rooted in a settler colonial vision of civil rights. Aztlan represents political power, and by that, I mean the formation of nation and government, and we must evaluate how these concepts work in our contemporary movement. It is one thing to say it, and it is entirely different matter to do it. So material conditions change, right? I mean, we know that. We look around the world, we see that the world changes all the time. And as a result of that, our understanding of Aztlan must adapt accordingly. Criticisms of Aztlan often stem from an inability to engage in ongoing analysis, which is a legitimate criticism, which is also crucial for keeping the anti-colonial movement relevant and powerful. The ongoing analysis is critical to keeping the anti-colonial movement relevant and powerful. The same is true of fetishizing Aztlan and ignoring the concerns and criticisms of other indigenous peoples. The myth of Aztlan remains part of the Mexicana cultural undercurrent, or remained part of the undercurrent for centuries, before resurfacing prominently in the late 20th century, starting in the late 1960s. Chicano nationalists were seeking a unifying mythology, began combining these foundational myths, not just Aztlan, but really also if we think about the way that the UFW began to use the image of the Virgin Guadalupe in a religious way, but also in a very secular and political way, right? It's a process that continues today as Chicano and Native American scholars, organizers, and activists dissect and reconceptualize what it means to be indigenous in the United States. So the meaning of Aztlan, particularly for Chicanos, is still evolving. When Al Urista presented the Plan de Aztlan in 1969 at the Chicano Youth Conference in Denver, Aztlan was introduced in a very simplistic way, understandable for the time. However, over the last 50 years, the simplicity of this idea has eroded, and Aztlan has taken on, a greater significance, really. And we'll talk I'll show you some evidence of that and what I mean by that a little bit later in the presentation. even to the point of influencing anti-immigration rhetoric in the United States. I mean, think about the Great Replacement, the Reconquista, border security, right? We see and hear about it every night on television. It is debated by presidential candidates. These concepts are tied. The concepts of the Reconquista and the Great Replacement and stuff, they are concepts that are tied to indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. They are feared by many, including people within the Chicano Latino communities. Aztlan is more than just a cultural reclamation. It directly addresses a return to history that Cabral is talking about. It is a call for a return to history, the same kind that Cabral is talking about. A return to history and indigeneity. It is an articulated vehicle for possible indigenous governance that is not sanctioned by the settler colonial government. So this slide delves into the historical roots of Aztlan a little bit. And we're going to look at it, I think, from a standpoint that isn't often explored. Although a lot of this information is not new. I didn't uncover, a whole bunch of new stuff. But I think it's the way that we put it together and talk about it that is a little bit different. So the story of Aztlan did not emerge from obscurity in 1969. It was not something that Alurista made up before he walked out on the stage, right? This is a very, very old story on this continent. And it's a story that has been perpetuated for the last 5 centuries by various individuals, really since the late 1500s. So this slide lists 4 key figures from that period who were responsible for preserving and spreading the legend of Aztlan through their writings. These texts that were written in Spanish and later translated into all of the major European languages, right? And we'll get a little sample of that in a second, helped to disseminate the story across the world. Although the Spanish conquistadors are often seen as bloodthirsty, and they were, it is clear that there were elements that recognized the importance of recording and preserving certain aspects of indigenous history, including the story of Aztlan. I don't think that this makes them good people. I think it should be read as a nod to the magnificence and the awe that these civilizations inspired. And this slide, highlights the continuity of Aztlan's narrative beginning in the late 1500s and onward. Also too, I think one of the things that Moctezuma had told Cortez was that his predecessor, one of his predecessors, Moctezuma I, had also sent, expeditions back trying to find Aztlan. So people have been looking for this for a very long time. So there are some notable works referencing Aztlan from 1700 to 1900. These are not the only ones. These are just ones that I decided to use because I thought that they were the most interesting, or they were the most interesting to me. This first one was written by an Italian historian. This second one was published in 1793, but it was actually written in the late 16th century, and it was published posthumously, the Crónica Mexicayot, which is a pretty famous book. But this one right here, Matic and Aztlan, I think is really pretty interesting. I mean, when I ran across this the first time, I was just like, that's fascinating. Matic and Aztlan is a poem. It's an epic poem written by a Welsh poet in 1795, and it was published in 1805. One of the things that this shows is that this story of Aztlan is known all over the world. And really think about it. People around the world were intensely interested in the civilizations of the Americas, including the Mexica and the Inca. So, the prevalence of writing about these subjects underscores that Aztlan was considered important, right? Even far from its place of origin. It was a legend that was repeated over and over again for hundreds of years. So this particular article, and this is where I think it gets kind of fun. This article ran in 1790 in the Connecticut Courant and Weekly Intelligencer. And the article itself that is the subject of this discussion is in the center aisle. And it has, it's not a very long article. And in part, I pulled out the part of it here. But what I will tell you is that this article runs over the course of the next 100 years into the earliest 20th century. This article, in one form or variation of it, like the language got a little bit more modern as time went on. But this particular article runs in newspapers all over the country. Hundreds of times you can find this article from 1790 to about 1920. This article is running just constantly, right? In these different places. But this is the earliest one that I could find. I'm sure that there are ones that are earlier. I just, they weren't in the database that I was using. So this is Aztlan in the 1800s. I mean, I myself at this point have probably 100 news articles that were published in newspapers across the world, mostly in the United States, but that talk about Aztlan. Where did the Aztecs come from, right? You can see here that this one on the far right, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, this is 1899. This is a full page spread in a major newspaper with graphics. That's a big story, right? I mean, that's a big story. Now, I think what's fun is this first one on the far left is a book review of Madoc and Aztlan. And he talks about a little bit here, I'll read from it. It says, the deep interest evinced on the subject of the Aztec children will probably call the attention of those skilled in historical and geographical research to these striking particulars, right? And this was written this ran in The Guardian in London in 1854. And it does a little excerpt from the poem. And it says, the city of Aztlan is thus described in Southey's Madoc. There Aztlan stood upon the farther shore, and the shade of the trees, its dwellings rose, their level roofs with turrets set around, and battlements all burnished white, therein shone like silver in the sunshine. I beheld the imperial city, her far circling walls, her garden groves and stately palaces, her temple mountains, sighs, her 1,000 roofs. And when I saw her might and majesty, my mind misgave me. That was written in 1854 by a Welsh poet. This is a subject of intense interest, widely known and discussed. So when I first moved to Prescott, Arizona, I noticed through a couple of different things that the city's founders were obsessed, right, with the Aztecs, with the Mexica. The main streets in downtown Prescott are named Moctezuma, Cortez, and Marina, which I call the Trinity of Drama. Now, I think that goes past the normal person, but as a Chicano Studies PhD, I'm not necessarily the normal person in that regard. And so it was something that I noticed right away. This particular article was written on May 11th, or it was published on May 11th, 1864. And it was written when U.S. settlers were trying to name the territory that would become the state of Aztlan, or the state of Arizona. The author who writes this, I can't really make his name out. It's one of the really badly faded parts of the article. Suggests naming the capital of the territory, which is Prescott at the time where I live, Aztlan, arguing that Arizona has the highest claim to be considered the original seat of the Toltec and Aztec empires. Although the name Prescott won out, Aztlan was a serious contender, and the Masonic Lodge in Prescott was named the Aztlan Lodge in 1864, showing how deeply embedded the concept of Aztlan was in the area's idea and imagination of the settlers. So this is what this guy wrote. He said that as much solicitude is manifested about the location of the capital of the new territory, let me suggest the importance of giving it an appropriate and characteristic name wherever it shall be located, and that name is Aztlan. Then he talks about Montezuma, and he says, he goes on to say that as Arizona has the highest claim to be considered the original seat of the Toltecs and the Aztec Empire, should not the capital, when elected, be called Aztlan? The name is original, euphonious, which means pleasant to the ear, and characteristic, and I have no doubt would be the restoration of the original name of the country. So, the first person that I met who placed Aztlan in a political framework was Apache Mais in his book, Looking for Aztlan, Birthright or Right for Birth. The first part of this book is an investigation into the many different names Aztlan has been called over the centuries. The second is a thorough discussion on the science of nation building. I believe this book is a mandatory read for anyone serious about discussion of the Chicano nation. So in terms of this slide, it was this sign right here that you see where it says Aztlan Lodge that set me on the course, that set me partially on the course of this specific presentation. I knew what Aztlan was from a Chicano studies, Chicano movement perspective, but I had given very little thought to what that meant outside of that. I mean, how often do you move to a city that was supposed to have been named Aztlan? I'm not gonna lie, I was a little shocked. After all, I had just finished a book called Insurgent Aztlan, and I thought to myself, how did I not know this? So I made it my business to know about Prescott, Arizona. The Aztlan Masonic Lodge was founded in 1864, the same year that the letter that we just looked at to the Arizona miner was written. Had the name Aztlan been chosen, I would be living today in Aztlan, Arizona. To further illustrate how widespread this information was, the book that is also on this slide was written by this gentleman, George Hartman, and it was published in 1852. The title of the book was Wooed by the Sphinx of Aztlan. And what he's talking about is a rock formation that is here in Prescott that currently it's still here. It's called Thumb Butte. And the reason it's called Thumb Butte is because from a particular angle, it actually does look like a thumb. But at that time, that rock formation was called the Sphinx of Aztlan. So, I mean, you know, as we begin to look at this, right, what we begin to understand is that this is a story that people knew. So this newspaper article was written, it ran on May 6, 1891. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when I saw this one, my jaw dropped a little bit. It really did. And there's really no other way to put it. This article is about President Benjamin McKinley's nationwide tour of the United States. And what it's specifically talking about is the train that he took this tour on. The train was known as the Presidential Special. It was the equivalent of Air Force One today, right? And so the president was traveling all over. There were 5 cars on this train. The first car of his train, immediately following the engine, was named the Aztlan. Now, this article is from the Tacoma Daily News on, like I said, May 6, 1891. But this exact article ran in hundreds of newspapers all across the country. And, you know, you can look it up, you can see it, and you'll see this exact article. So it describes the interior of each car, of each of the cars in the 5 compartments. And so when we talk about, I mean, what this really comes down to is that nationwide, people were reading about the train that the president was riding on. And the name of the first car was the Aztlan. But in none of these articles does anybody say, what does that mean? What's the Aztlan? we don't understand what that's there. There's no connection about, there's no confusion about the connection, right, with the United States president. I mean, what this tells us, and it's clear that Aztlan, or the idea or the concept or the history of it, held cultural significance at that moment within the United States. The concept of Aztlan was associated with the so-called Aztec civilization and its mythical homeland. This connection to a rich and storied history might have been seen at the time as fitting for a luxurious train car designed for the President of the United States. Now, also understand too that in 1891, there was no fear of indigenous history. Think about that. So to recap, right, throughout the 17 and 1800s, numerous articles and books reference the Mexica, the Aztec, and Aztlan. The legend of Aztlan was a topic of widespread interest, with many newspaper articles published throughout the 1800s. However, by the 1960s, mentions of the Aztecs and Aztlan had almost disappeared from mainstream media. It was like, almost by 1930, it really started to slow down. And I mean, if you think about it, 1930 is a pretty pivotal moment in terms of like the repatriation and the way that Mexicans in the United States particularly were being sort of recast or recategorized, right? So when the Plan de Aztlan was presented at the Chicano Youth Conference in Denver in 1969, there was an Associated Press article, and it's right here to the left, right, that is titled "New Nation Urged." And this article ran, and this is not an exaggeration, in hundreds of newspapers, maybe thousands of newspapers. There were a lot more newspapers at the time across the country. And for those of you who maybe aren't old enough to really remember or even have really experienced how important newspapers were, this is where people got their news, right? When you sat down and read the newspaper, you read the whole thing. So it says, "New Nation Urged. Young Spanish Americans from more than a dozen states called Sunday for the formation of a new nation to be called Aztlan. Aztlan is an Indian word which refers to the formerly Mexican land, now part of the United States, which was inhabited by Mexican Americans before present U.S. states were formed." Okay, this widespread coverage, I believe, indicates the announcement of an intention to create a new nation called Aztlan, and that intention was considered significant by the white colonial media and was read by hundreds of thousands of people. So you see, the call for Aztlan is not only a cultural reclamation, right? It is a political statement on par with the Declaration of Independence and other such documents demanding sovereignty and self-determination. The Declaration of Independence did not create the United States government. It stated the intention and the reason why it should happen. The Constitution created the government of the United States, and it was ratified in 1788, 12 years after the Declaration of Independence and one war later. So let me be perfectly clear. The Partido Nacional's position is that Aztlan is not a call for territory. Claiming territory without discussion or a way of forming formal agreements, i.e. treaties with other nations, would be presumptuous, naive, and fatal to any real effort to decolonize the Americas. Also, in no way is the information being presented in this past section offered as some sort of proof about a claim to land within the borders of the United States. It is being presented solely to provide a historicized, contextualized, politicized, and indigenized version of Aztlan history we are rarely privy to. So we're going to shift again a little bit in kind of moving into the last part of this presentation. And what we're going to talk about is the demographic imperative, right? Because we've talked about who are we, we've talked about our material condition. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do about it. So the Mexican American population in the US is projected to grow significantly in the coming decades. This demographic shift has profound implications for the Chicano movement and the broader indigenous political landscape. As our community grows, so does the potential for our political influence. But let's be clear, that is not certain. This presents both opportunities and challenges. The Chicano movement must figure out how to strategically lever our growing numbers to advance the goal of national liberation. The concept of Aztlan resonates with a growing segment of our population. This indicates a rising interest in self-determination and political empowerment outside of traditional settler colonial frameworks. Survey data collected by the Partido Nacional shows that a substantial portion of Mexican Americans, perhaps as high as 20%, or what would be approximately 7.4 million people, identify with the idea of Aztlan as a modern geopolitical entity. This highlights the potential for Aztlan to become a powerful force in shaping the political future of our community. This also underscores the urgency of developing a clear and effective political strategy to harness this demographic momentum. Building on the previous slide, this one examines whether Aztlan is a myth. It's the same slide that as the Aztec homeland, a modern geopolitical formation. Notably, 49% of respondents believe Aztlan is the Aztec homeland, which I want to point out is a number I don't think any of us have a hard time believing, because as we've seen, this is a narrative that has been perpetuated globally for centuries. I mean, of course, half of the people believe this, right? However, and you know, they're not wrong. However, the 20% who view Aztlan as a modern geopolitical entity represent a significant political shift I am willing to wager has happened over the past 50 years. By 2070, projections based on growth rates suggest that 24.4 million people of Mexican American descent, I should say, could hold this belief. Possibly. It's all a projection, right? However, even if that's true, belief alone is no indicator of success. While these are projections, and this is just a Zoom conversation we are having, it would be very naive to assume that government entities are not also analyzing these numbers. I mean, it really would be. And what are the implications of that, right? The complexities of racism and colonialism entrenched for over 500 years make this a critical issue to understand and address. The issue of possibilities, the issue of projections, right? That is what we need to understand, and that is what we need to address. The 2010 census, which allowed people to self-identify their ethnicity, which was the first and the last time, kind of like the 1930 census was the first and last time that Mexican was like a category by itself on the United States Census. As a result of this offer, 175,494 people identified both as Mexican American and Indian. They identified as Mexican American Indians. This identification has serious political implications, especially considering the projected growth of this group by 2066. Conservative projections suggest around 1 million people may share this identity by then, with a potential of up to 5 million. This growth isn't just about numbers, it's about fostering a political ideology within the community. The conversation around Aztlan is evolving, reflecting a deeper understanding of indigenous identity and resistance to assimilation. This will most likely disrupt existing power structures and lead for greater recognition and representation. A larger demographic group with a distinct cultural and political identity could wield more political power. It is evident a growing segment of the Mexican American population seeks political empowerment outside of traditional settler colonial frameworks. The concept of irredentism, the claim to territory based on historical or cultural ties, is not new and applies to the demands of the Chicano movement. irredentist movements aim to reclaim land perceived as rightfully belonging to a nation, similar to the Palestinian demand for the right of return, a topic explored by our Vice Chair Ernesto Ayala in his presentation From Aztlan to Palestine. For Chicano and other indigenous peoples, Aztlan represents such a contention, challenging settler colonial rule and advocating for self-determination. The name Aztlan itself is no less important than the struggle for political sovereignty it represents, rooted in the right to reclaim indigenous self-determination and sovereignty. The ongoing discussions about pro and con around Aztlan are crucial in shaping the political and cultural landscape of this movement. The growing number of individuals identifying with the dual heritage of Mexican American and Native will most likely lead to increased political mobilization around issues of common concern. This could result in the formation of new political organizations or alliances focused on advancing the sovereignty and self-determination of all indigenous people. Aztlan, as a political idea centered on sovereignty and self-determination for the Chicano community and other indigenous groups, has in it the critical question of whether we have the political will to pursue national liberation. While 90% of the survey respondents that the Partido did believe Chicanos are a distinct people politically and culturally, this belief doesn't automatically translate into political action. The challenge lies in uniting around this political idea that we are distinct and moving forward with determination to make that a reality. Aztlan also represents the idea of total resistance to settler colonialism through the creation of culture, economics, politics, and government. Aztlan itself is a critique of settler colonial rule. It challenges the right of settlers to control Chicana OX destiny. Aztlan is a potential vehicle to transcend politics of colonial subjugation. It is a potential vehicle for liberation that requires the creation of insurgent spaces where indigenous people resist assimilation in an ongoing manner and cultural erasure in an ongoing manner through political and cultural and social and economic creation. Aztlan is about establishing self-rule and national self-determination from settler colonial history. It is a return to history. So I was born in 1966. If I am alive in 2066, I will be 100 years old. My youngest child, who is now 17, almost 18, will be a mere 60 years old, 2 years older than I am today. I point all this out because it is important to understand that everything that we are talking about is happening within your lifetime and my lifetime. It's not happening tomorrow. We don't got to get something started, right? It is happening right now. It is a brown repopulation of the continent, and there is no escaping the growth of these brown bodies and their search for politics, culture, and sovereignty. By 2066, 1/3 of all the bodies in this country will be descendants of indigenous survivors. But what does that mean for us right now in terms of political developments? The growth of the Mexican American population from 7 million in 1966 to a projected 61.1 million by 2066 is astounding. However, this rapid growth poses a political challenge, right? The challenge is that our movement has not kept pace politically with this demographic change. We must learn to communicate our political ideas effectively and embrace the political, ideological, and national diversity within our community to build a strong national liberation movement. The future of Aztlan is uncertain, but it currently remains a political idea that transcends settler territorial claims, focuses on identity, material conditions, and it offers a vision of national reconciliation within a marginalized society. Our survey data shows that a significant portion of Chicano OX community feels disconnected from the current US political system, and many would join an indigenous Chicano political party if one existed. However, our challenge is to move beyond reactive activism and think about governance, policy, and long-term strategy. The future of Aztlan could involve many things, but ultimately the main requirement is imagination. We have to be able to imagine a cultural renaissance, to imagine the revitalization of indigenous languages, arts, and traditions. We have to imagine that we are capable of self-governance within a defined territory, with control over our education, healthcare, and resource management. We have to imagine self-determination and the development of sustainable industries and trade networks that benefit the Chicano community. And ultimately, we have to imagine true environmental stewardship and the protection of ancestral lands and natural resources for future generations. Imagine resistance and empowerment, and then imagine how we make this a reality. However, realize this potential requires a clear understanding of the political landscape and the challenges ahead. And while we want to inspire hope, and that it's important to inspire hope, we must be realistic about all the possible futures of Aztlan, including political and social fragmentation. I mean, imagine endless and internal divisions and competing interests within the movement. Imagine backlash and repression, unending resistance and opposition from groups that feel threatened by the Chicano movement. Imagine repression and potential government surveillance, harassment, or violence against activists. Imagine how real the disillusionment of unfulfilled promises is if the movement fails to achieve its goals. The risk of undermining broader social goals. Recognizing these challenges is crucial for the movement's success. But it's not hard to imagine any of these at all, is it? No, it's not. The political reality within the contemporary Chicano movement is that we are already dealing full throttle with all these issues, and we're not handling it very well. The future of Aztlan, actually, let's take Aztlan off the table for a second. And the future of any movement whatsoever has to be a collective vision that requires imagination, strategic planning, and a commitment to building a strong and resilient movement. So this picture, we talked a little bit about this happening, within our lifetime, but I want to show you this because this also occurred to me as I was doing this research about Aztlan. The woman in this picture, this older woman right here in the green dress, is my great-grandmother, Ethel Pittenger. She was born in 1882. The young men that are around her are my cousins. They don't really figure into this story. The other two pictures are me. The smaller one was taken in 1966, and knowing my mother the way I do, I was probably about 3 months old when this was taken. This other picture, this black and white one, is my great-grandmother when she was a little girl. And this picture was most likely probably taken in the 1800s too, before the turn of the century. So she was born shortly after the events that we talked about in Prescott, Arizona had transpired. I knew my great-grandmother. I knew her. I was 10 years old when she passed away, and I remember her. I remember going to her house. I remember talking to her. I don't remember what we talked about, but I remember that we did talk. And most importantly, I remember going to the hospital when she was dying. All right. When Ethel Pittenger was born, the United States military's genocidal war against Native people in Arizona was winding down, but it hadn't ended. When my great-grandmother was born, who I knew as a young boy, when she was born, they were still killing in outright war natives in Arizona. But within the span of her lifetime and mine, right, the political situation for Chicanos and indigenous people has gone from one of open warfare, of open genocidal warfare against Native people, to discussions of indigenous national liberation. Much has changed. And really, when you think of it this way, it has changed quickly. What is even more interesting to me from a personal standpoint is that on this entire side of my family, settlers, all from England, Ireland, and Scotland, that they have all been replaced by Mexican and Black descendants. In my mind, that is the true potential of what it is that we are talking about. So implementation is critical, but often overlooked as an aspect of the Chicano movement. Achieving our goals requires careful planning and a deep understanding of what it means to enact political change. We must develop a Chicano politic that is not merely a reaction to settler colonialism, but one that reflects our indigenous roots and aspirations. This process involves setting realistic goals and objectives and committing to the long-term work of political development. So, we've discussed these first three questions. Who are we? What is our material condition? But before concluding, I want to offer an example of what can be done about it. For the past 4 years, I've been organizing with the Partido Nacional de la Raza Unida, a legacy organization from the Chicano power movement of the 1960s and 70s. In 2020, Ernesto Ayala initiated conversations about revitalizing the Partido. We started with 5 or 6 people and now have over 50 members across 8 states. Our focus has been on building a solid core for the party. We'll be sharing a flyer in the chat with more details about membership. I want to thank Alex Garcia of El Indio Art for some of the incredible pieces that I've used throughout this presentation, which I think, really honors the past and looking towards the future. We want to encourage people to join the Partido. But we want to be really clear that for us, that doesn't mean leaving your current organization. Our aim is to build a national movement that unites different organizations and people to create a political front for Chicano, and Chicanx people across the country. So when we think about it, like a Partido is key, right? So throughout this presentation, we've emphasized the importance of political organization within the Chicano movement. To take our efforts to the next level, we need to create larger organizations that address national issues. Forming a political party is essential for success in the national liberation struggle. And we know this isn't a new concept. It's grounded in Marxist theory and other liberation movements worldwide. A party is necessary to challenge and resist settler colonialism on every level, local, national, and international. A party provides the opportunity to engage in negotiations and diplomacy, not just with the settler colonial system, but with other countries. Until we succeed in our national liberation struggle, we are bound by the rules of the settler colonial system. Engaging in the system, even if it means the deals are unfavorable, is a necessary step in asserting our position and status. A national party can shape public opinion and garner international support, which is crucial for advancing the liberation struggle. Chicanos across the country are working on similar issues, but to influence public opinion beyond their local areas, we need to think nationally and internationally. The Raza Unida party can serve as a unifying force within the Chicano movement. At this stage, we need to scale up our efforts, which requires a coordination, centralized policy, and leadership. Allegiance should be to the nation, not just to the individual groups or leaders. A unified political front can effectively challenge existing power structures and advocate for indigenous rights and self-determination. So the National Plebiscite Program is a voting mechanism for Chicano OX people and others to voice their opinions on issues important to them. It aims to address the political disengagement of those who feel the settler colonial elections don't represent their concerns. The plebiscite serves as a platform for participation in the politics of the Chicano movement, offering a more inclusive and representative decision-making process. And while tactics are always up for debate, we recognize that the Partido must sometimes take what will be viewed as a middle-of-the-road Chicano movement approach to effectively represent the community nationwide. We're not talking about middle-of-the-road neoliberal politics, but middle-of-the-road Chicano politics. Although this approach may draw criticism, it is crucial to walk before we can run. And as a political party, the Partido Nacional or any similar party has the right to engage in international forums and seek diplomatic and political support from other nations and organizations. Activist organizations are important, But to truly challenge colonialism, we must form political parties that can lead us to governance. This is the proven path to ending colonialism worldwide. This concludes the presentation. I want to thank you for listening and being part of the discussion. If there are any questions, we can address them now.